Hi everyone, I'm Ali Leetsy, Marketing Manager at Semperis, and I would like to thank you for joining our webinar today on WhoDunnit, what you should care about in AD auditing. Our presenter today will be Darren Mar-Elia, Microsoft MVP and Semperis' own Head of Product. And before we get started today, I just wanted to go over a little bit of housekeeping. Today's webinar is going to be recorded, and we will be sharing the link with you within a few days. All attendees will be on listening only mode throughout the entire webinar. And if you have any questions for Darren, please feel free to post them using the webinar question tool, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. All right, so before we get started our presentation today, I just want to take a quick poll to gauge where everyone is at with their Active Directory auditing. So our question is, how many of you have some Active Directory auditing in place today? I'll give you guys a few moments to answer the question. All right, and I'm going to close the poll. All right, so it seems that most of you have fully implemented AD auditing and it works as expected. So that's great. And we are going to now, with that information, pass the mic over to Darren to get today's presentation started.
Hey, Ali, thanks for that. And thanks for everyone for taking time today to join us. Interesting poll results. I think it was roughly evenly split between you have AD auditing and it's doing what you want, and you have AD auditing and maybe it's not ideal. And a healthy 20% of you have no AD auditing and you like to be surprised by AD, which is also good. It's not uncommon actually. So what I want to talk about, there's plenty of information out there in excruciating detail about event IDs that correspond to certain activities, et cetera. And what I really want to focus on is sort of thinking about what you should care about with respect to Active Directory auditing. What is important to pay attention to immediately versus not, and then some, kind of basic information about the kinds of events that you should be thinking about looking for. I want to do a couple things in this webinar. One is I'm going to go through some kind of, sort of foundational stuff around enabling and configuring auditing. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that, but I just want to level set with everyone to make sure everyone's on the same page. The other thing I want to do, once I kind of talk through AD auditing, is give a quick spin through of our DS Protector for AD product. I'll do that after I focus on the auditing part. And DS Protector for AD is our product that does Active Directory change tracking and auditing and the ability to undo those changes. So we'll spend some time in there, and then, as Ali said, we'll take some questions. But I do want to make this, part educational, part informational. So let's kind of dig in a little bit about me. For those of you who don't know me, I go by the tag GPO guy. I've been at a website called gpoguy.com for many years. I've been a 14-time Microsoft Group Policy and more recently renamed to Cloud and Data Center MVP. And I've also spent quite a long time working in IT in addition to being on the software side. So I spent 20 years plus or minus in large corporate IT, doing mostly Microsoft infrastructure. And if you've followed me over the years, you know that I've written books and spoken at conferences about mostly Microsoft infrastructure and especially group policy. And the stuff that I don't talk about so much is that I am an amateur, some would say very amateur winemaker. I race bicycles, been doing that for about 30 years. And I've recently kind of gained an interest in artificial intelligence and machine learning. So that's sort of my hobby these days from a tech perspective. And I am head of product for Semperis. So who is Semperis? Well, we are focused on Active Directory protection and recovery. So we have the Semperis DS Protector for AD product that I just mentioned, real-time granular attribute change tracking, auditing, comparison, and restoral. And the Semperis AD Forest Recovery product. So this is a product that allows for fully automated forest recovery of your Active Directory in the event of a total disaster. So everything from logical corruption of AD to some malware-based attack that's directed at AD, we play in that space and allow you to automate the recovery of your forest. So let's talk a little bit about auditing. What are the challenges of AD auditing? Well, I think none of this is going to be news to those of you who are already doing it, but there is a ton of data generated. So every domain controller that can originate changes and events and logons is going to generate audit data, and most of you are probably collecting all of that and dumping it into a SIEM of some kind that may or may not ever get looked at. And so we're in sort of this information overload space where we get a ton of data and we're expected to sort of pick out the important parts about it. There's a lot, in a lot of cases, there's not a lot of context on an individual event. So you don't know what the event relates to. This sort of the idea that a particular logon event or a particular process creation event may or may not be important depending on the context. And then there's lots of different event types to worry about. You're interested in changes, you're interested in logon and log offs, you're interested in people trying to guess passwords. There's a lot of different types of data. So from my perspective, the key is, and the goal is to try to maximize the information that you get from auditing and minimize the data. So if we think about information as something with context and meaning, and data as just a bunch of bits and bytes, obviously we can drown in the bits and bytes, and we really want to maximize the information we're getting. So with that context laid, I want to do a quick walkthrough of auditing. And again, this is shouldn't be news to many of you, but I do want to just kind of level set and talk about how things work from an AD auditing perspective. So let's take a simple example. I'm going to go ahead, and I've got Antoinette here. I'm going to go ahead and change her description to hello. And I've changed her description. If I come into the security event log on the DC that has originated that change, I will see a couple of directory services changes that appear in the event log. Let me go ahead and here's the change that was related to Antoinette, and you'll see that I added a value of hello to her description attribute. So that change has been logged and I know about it. If this were a modification of an event, of an attribute, so let's say I go back into Antoinette and I say hello to is now the description. When that event gets logged again, we'll give it some time to percolate through as I'm throwing a ton of events in my system. Now you notice that I've gotten two events related to that one change that I did. The first event is the deletion of the old value, hello, and the second event is the addition of the new value, hello to. So the way auditing works in Active Directory is at least in the case of attribute modifications, it's going to send me two events for every single attribute modification I do. It's a little bit clumsy sometimes, but it at least does show you the events of what's happening. Now, how am I getting that information? Well, I'm doing it using a couple of different mechanisms. One is that I am enabling group policy, I'm enabling auditing using, in this case, group policy. So if I come into my default domain controllers OU and I drill into Windows settings, security settings, advanced audit policy configuration, then I have a number of options that I can enable. And if I come in under DS or Directory Services Access, you'll see that the big one that is generating those 5136 events is Audit Directory Services Changes set to success. Now, advanced audit policy configuration was a feature that was added in Server 2008, and then group policy enabled in Server 2008 R2. Before that, we had under local policies, we had audit policy, and we had these very coarse-grained, high-level categories that were not configurable at a very detailed level. So when Microsoft introduced advanced audit policy, they gave us the ability within a particular category to enable or disable subcategories. And so I typically recommend to anyone that is using that has operating systems that support this today, which pretty much should be everyone if you're in 2008 R2 or above, that you shift from the more coarse-grained auditing, which just generates a ton of events, to the more fine-grained one where you can control more specifically what events take place. You can force Active Directory, or you can force the targeting, the Windows Server, to ignore the old policy categories, the old audit categories, by enabling this setting. So force audit policy subcategory settings to override audit policy category settings. That's a fairly verbose way of saying that you can essentially disable the old audit policy by enabling this one and only use the new policy. Otherwise, if you have both defined, then both sets of events will be generated, which is fine if you have lots and lots of space to store all your logs. Of course, you can configure as well through group policy the size of the event log, right? So you can set the security and retention method within group policy for the size of your logs. And I know large organizations that even with large event log sizes, they will be rolling over their security event logs on domain controllers within 20 minutes or less, sometimes much less. So you obviously need a way of collecting these, getting them off the box into a storage mechanism, and that's what most organizations that have some sort of auditing in place are using their SIEM collection system for. And that's all well and good, but again, for me, the goal is, how do I get to the things that I really care about knowing about within Active Directory? So that was just a quick and dirty walkthrough of enabling auditing. Actually, one thing I want to point out before I move on is I showed you the audit subcategories, but the other piece of the puzzle is making sure that you have the correct system access controls in place, or SACLs in place on AD itself, to be able to audit changes. So there are a number of default SACLs that are built into AD. If I go into a particular container, and I need to change to advanced view here, the most redundant command in Active Directory users and computers. Go ahead and go in under security and advanced and auditing. This is the SACL, or system access control list, and this decides what is going to get sent to the audit log from an Active Directory perspective. So what you'll see here is I have a SACL for the everyone group, which means anyone that touches this object, where it will generate audit events for any operation on this object, meaning the HQOU, and any objects underneath it. So I can have very fine-grained control over what things get audited within Active Directory. Now, I'll have to admit that most folks are probably not tinkering with this all that much because of the complexity of doing that. But you obviously want to ensure that you have SACLs in place, because even if you turn on those audit subcategories that I mentioned here, if you don't have a SACL in place for a given object, you're never going to see events related to it. So those two pieces go hand in hand. Okay, great. So let me get back to my slideshow. So what should you care about? I like to categorize auditing data into two rough categories. One is AD change activity. So that's changes made to Active Directory objects, whether it be users and computers or sites and subnets in the configuration partition, or if you're using Active Directory integrated DNS entry changes, or even GPO changes, a topic that's near and dear to my heart. You want to be able to see that change activity. Now, not all of it is super relevant or super important, and I'll get to that in a second, but you nevertheless want to know that those changes are happening. And you know, to the extent that you may want to undo a change, you need to know that those changes are happening. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in our DS Protector demo. The other side of the fence is Active Directory usage activity. So this is the stuff that tends to be a lot more voluminous when you're getting log on and log off events from DCs, when you're getting service ticket granting or ticket granting in Kerberos, when you're getting account lockouts, when you're getting machine account password resets, all of that usage information, depending on how many of those audit policy knobs and switches you've enabled, you're going to get a ton of data. You may even be, so if you're using, for example, process creation auditing, you are going to get a tremendous amount of data. And I know in some of the previous Microsoft security guidelines and even some of the sort of industry standard guidelines, the amount of auditing that they had turned on by default in their baselines was such that you would pretty much be guaranteed to roll over your event logs every 10 to 15 minutes, even in a moderately sized environment. So I suspect some of you have probably backed off on some of that. But the point is here that these events, these other AD usage activities, have a tendency to be very, very verbose. And it's very much a needle in the haystack kind of operation with a lot of those. So the other thing that I like to distinguish between are critical events and operational events. So critical events I categorize as events that you want to know about immediately, that you want to be notified, that you want to be notified about them, right? So I don't need to get an email every time an Active Directory change happens or every time, you know, an administrator logs into a server. That would just render notification completely useless. Most IT admins that I know would tend to start ignoring those over time. But I do want to know when critical events happen. So security related AD changes, somebody added someone to the domain admins group, or somebody reset the Kerb TGT account password. So those kinds of activities I definitely want to know about. Now, operational events are events that, you know, I want to log and I want to track, but they don't require my immediate attention. So things like changes to regular group memberships, changes to distribution lists. Actually, let's dive in and look at some of the different kinds of events in each category. Pardon me while I take a sip of water. When I talk this much, it's I need to take breaks every once in a while. But let's see, critical AD change events. So modification of privileged group memberships. So domain admins is the obvious one, but all of you within your environments, you know, we tend to focus a lot on domain admins when we're, you know, reading security white papers about lateral movement attacks and other kinds of compromises to AD. But each of you has your own concept of privilege groups, right? So if you have a bunch of servers that are holding customer data, then accounts that have administrative access to those servers are privileged as far as I'm concerned. So those are, you know, groups that have some import to your organization. Now, for sure, the built-in groups like domain admins, administrators, schema admins, enterprise admins, you want to know immediately when those change or when something has happened to some of those groups, or even to some kind of privileged users that you might have that might have membership in those groups. But you may have additional groups that you want to define as privileged groups in your environment. So Akals on privileged accounts and groups. In my last webinar that I gave in March, where I talked about 5 tips for sort of waylaying attackers that are going after Active Directory. I talk about the Akal attack path that was introduced in the Bloodhound 1.3 release. And the Akal attack path is where attackers look for soft Akals within privileged groups or users or objects that they are able to exploit. And a soft Akal might be, somebody that's been granted the change password or the full control over a particular OU, which would give them the ability to modify group memberships, to reset passwords, etc. So, seeing Akal changes happening where somebody might have taken advantage of an inadvertent full control access to grant full control or to grant additional access to privileged accounts or groups is something you want to know about. Akal changes on the admin SD holder container. So if you're familiar with this container, it's in the system container under the domain partition. This is the container that kind of controls the access control list on privileged built-in objects within Active Directory. And so if you see an Akal change on that, somebody's trying to mess around with the privileged access that built-in special administrative accounts get. Password resets on privileged user accounts by non-privileged users. So obviously there's very few circumstances where a help desk person should be resetting the password on a domain admin. You want to have a process in place where privileged users are managing privileged users and not non-privileged users getting access to those accounts. So this is just a basic control mechanism where if a help desk person has the ability to reset domain admins, then a compromise of Active Directory and those privileged accounts is only as far away as that help desk user that gets compromised. So this is an area where you want to pay attention to password resets that are happening on those key accounts. And then, of course, unauthorized GPO changes. So, when a GPO changes, it should be a fairly rare event, and you should have a process in place for having it be controlled, whether it's a GP change control solution or some kind of GP auditing solution. You want to know when a GP change happens because it could be modifying security, it could be doing any number of things that could compromise your systems, or just plain old break your system. So you just want to know when a GPO change occurs. And you may be interested in knowing about specific GPOs, like if it's the default domain controller's policy or the default domain policy, you may be interested in knowing exactly which of your critical GPOs is being changed. But the point is, I consider that to be a critical AD change event. And last one, so AD integrated DNS record changes. So because if you're using AD integrated DNS, because somebody can do sort of nefarious things with DNS if they want to, and because it's stored in Active Directory, you want to know when DNS record changes happen that could cause problems. Maybe somebody changes an SRV record, or they changed an NS record, or they've added a CNAME for some particular reason or another. You probably want to know about some of those. Now, not all of them, because you've got workstations and servers registering their DNS names, registering their A records on a dynamic basis. Not everything is interesting from that perspective. Okay, so critical AD usage events, account lockouts. This is an oldie but goodie. If you're using account lockout, you want to know. If you're seeing repeated lockouts on an account, you want to know about it. Incorrect password guessing. So there's a fairly recent phenomenon called password spray attacks. This is where an attacker who has a list of your user accounts, which is, if they're on the network and in the domain is fairly easy to get. In order to avoid account lockouts, they do password dictionary attacks against a cluster of users, and they do it in a timed manner. So they can figure out fairly easily, again, if your password policy is accessible to a regular domain user, they can find out what your lockout thresholds are, and they can do very controlled, automated password guessing against, let's say, 100 or 1,000 accounts guess once, incorrect, wait, guess again, incorrect, wait, guess again, incorrect, wait. On and on. They can keep doing that, and they won't lock out accounts because they're not meeting your threshold, but they're able to do a fairly effective dictionary attack against lots of user accounts. So you want to be able to note that kind of activity happening, which wouldn't show up as a normal account lockout event, of course. It would show up as a password spray. Logon events by non-privileged users on privileged systems. So you want to know when if you're using the recommended Microsoft tiering approach, where you have tier 0 being domain controllers, tier 1 being servers, tier 2 being workstations, and never the twain shall meet. Domain controller tier 0 admins shouldn't be logging on to workstations or servers. Server admins shouldn't be logging on to DCs. Workstation admins should definitely not be logging on to DCs. So being able to track if that kind of stuff is happening is what I would consider to be a critical AD usage event. Golden ticket usage. This is really hard to track down. There's some great articles about how you can kind of suss out potential golden ticket usage. So golden ticket is when somebody compromises the LM hash of the Kerb TGT account, and they're able to issue arbitrary TGTs, arbitrary ticking grant. I'm getting tongue-tied on that one. Let's just leave it at TGTs. So they're basically able to get access to your accounts by having that Kerb TGT ticket, and really any account. Kerberosting, which is another activity I talked about in my last webinar, where you've got somebody has compromised through a kind of an unused SPN on a user account. They've compromised that user account, gained the hash, and they can issue service tickets on behalf of that user for pretty much any service they want. Again, a little bit harder to find in the security event logs, but the kind of activity that you're interested in looking for. So those are some of my critical AD usage types of scenarios. And then again, sort of from an operational perspective, changes to non-security related attributes. So again, these are operational events. These are things that I don't need to be notified on immediately, but I might want to hear about, or at least be able to go back and forensically look at in the past, or even maybe take action on, as I'll show with our DS Protector product. Creation, modification, deletion of users, computers, contacts, distribution lists. In and of itself, not something I really need to know about unless it's privileged accounts or service accounts or other types of objects that I really care about. Kerberos SPN changes, again, normally not an activity I care about. In certain circumstances it may be, but generally speaking, probably not. Creation, deletion of AD subnets. This one could go either way. If you have a really tight control over who's creating subnets and sites, then and you know when that's happening, then if you see change events related to this, that could be important to know about right away. But in general, this is probably not a critical AD change event. Some of the AD usage events that you really probably don't want to know about right away, just general Kerb and NTLM account log on and log off events. Service ticket granting, that's happening all the time in a reasonably sized environment. You will be snowed under if you try to pay attention to all of those. Computer user account password changes, again, happening all the time. Object access and process start events. Some people are actually have these kinds of events enabled, and it is really busy to do that. So I typically recommend that unless you absolutely positively have to, that you avoid doing that kind of auditing, because you're just going to be buried in object access and process start events. Another one that I like to bring up, because I don't think that everyone has heard about it or is using it, is sismon. So sismon is a separate utility that Microsoft provides through the sysinternals website. So if you're familiar with sysinternals, Mark Rusinovich's set of utilities that we all love and live by. And sismon is a relatively old solution that has evolved over time to become a threat hunting tool. And so sismon can run as a service and can be configured via group policy. It logs its events to the this log path that I point out here, this Microsoft Windows sismon operational log, which is under the applications and services logs in the event viewer. So it does log to the event log, just in a separate log from security. There's a good article that I list here that points out some use cases for tracking suspicious activity. What sismon is doing is it's tracing very detailed process creation, network connection creation at the system level. And I know shops that have deployed this on every one of their client endpoints, in addition to server endpoints, in addition to domain controllers. It does generate a ton of data, so you sort of have to tweak it and configure it. And there's a ton of guidance out there for building a configuration file that will really narrow in on the things that you're interested in. Like, for example, if you can use it to detect Mimikatz process creation on your system and basically alert on that. So there's a lot of flexibility in this thing, almost too much in some respects, but it's super helpful from a threat hunting perspective, and even forensically going back after the fact to see what has been going on a system that has been compromised. And just to sort of follow up on that, I've got a bunch of resources here that are good links to looking for what sorts of event log events, specific events. You know, so this is sort of the details, the nuts and bolts of what you should be looking for from a event log perspective. In fact, what I'm going to do, because it's not terribly useful to look at links on your screen and try to click them and realize you can't click them. So what I'm doing right now is I'm pasting into the chat window all of the links that I just listed. And so you should be able to get to each of those links from your chat window in GoToWebinar and click on those and get to that information. I'll say that this Detecting Lateral Movement Through Tracking Event Logs white paper came out about a year or so ago, maybe a little bit longer now, is just a wealth of knowledge and detail around how you can detect lateral movement attacks through the event viewer. Super interesting if you haven't seen it already. All right, so with that, I think we're going to do another poll, Allie, before I dump into the Semperis demo.
All right, great. Thanks, Darren. Yeah, we're going to take a quick poll break before diving into the next section. So our next poll is, if you are auditing your AD today, what activities provide the most value to you? All right, we'll just wait a few more moments. All right. So it looks like,
I think all of the above wins.
Yep, that's good.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's good information. Thanks, everyone.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, and we'll carry on with Darren showing us a demonstration of how Semperis could help you with your AD auditing.
Great. So what I'm going to show now, which you should be seeing on your screen, is our DS Protector for AD product. And what I'm going to do is log out, because I think my session is timed out, and log back in. And what DS Protector for AD is designed to do is to give you the ability to track changes in Active Directory, including who made the change, and be able to revert those changes as needed. And as you can see from the interface, we provide kind of an overview of the change activity that's happening in Active Directory. So this trending graph shows you for the domain partition, the number of changes that have happened, the number of deletions that have happened. And if I flip into the changed items view, you'll see changes as they're happening in my system here in my Active Directory. And you remember from my earlier demo where I was changing Antoinette's attribute, their description attribute, you'll see here that I've got a modification event showing up by the administrator account for Antoinette on her description attribute with the before and after value. So I can see all of those changes that have happened as they're happening in Active Directory. And if I just simply right click on this event and just click on OK, we actually go ahead and undo the change that we just made to Antoinette. So this could be any number of changes. Let me just go in and give you an example of how this works. So I'm going to grab a bunch of users, and let's say I'm an administrator in here making some changes, and I accidentally, I wanted to change one user's office location, but I accidentally changed their office location for a bunch of different users. Now I've gone ahead and made that change. The other thing I'm going to go do is I happen to be messing around in here with privileges that I shouldn't have, and I'm going to go ahead and add a user that shouldn't be in the domain admins group to the domain admins group. And then, oh, by the way, I think I'll go in here and delete the test machine called test1. And so now I've performed a bunch of activities. Maybe what I'll also do is I'll go into subnet objects that I have here, and I'm going to look at this, and maybe I change the description on this subnet object just to show that I can track changes to subnet objects. Or maybe I'll just define, let's see, that's probably good. So we'll go ahead and see what's going on there. So now if I refresh, if I go back to my changed items screen, you'll see that the changes that I've made, in this case to the domain admins group, have been captured. So Darren was the one that made this change to domain admins, added Cara Bird, not really happy with that. So I'm going to go ahead and remove Cara from the domain admins group. And if I go back to my changed items view, here are all my changes to the office location of the users that I didn't mean to change. So what we can do is we can do very specific and granular filtering on my changes that are happening. It could be time-based if I knew it was within the last week or within the last month or however long I've kept data for. I knew it was the physical delivery office name, and so I'm going to grab that. And I knew that Darren was the one that ran the errant script or whatever it was that caused the problem. So I'm going to go ahead and search for changes made by Darren. And now I've narrowed my list to just the changes that I made related to that attribute. And I can simply select all of those user accounts and say undo selected. And we will go ahead and undo those changes. Now, just while this is going on, something interesting to note, we are taking a different approach to how we capture the state of Active Directory and then give you the ability to undo it. So the changes that we're gathering here are being gathered using basically the same mechanism that Active Directory domain controllers use to talk to each other. So when our agent is listening for changes to Active Directory, we're using things like the universal sequence, the update sequence number to determine when the last set of changes was that we received on the domain controller, and we grab that information and use it to populate these fields within the Semperis DS Protector product. In addition to that, we are also grabbing security events that are coming from the Active Directory domain controller security event log and cross-correlating those with the replication changes that we see to create this single unified record of what the change was and who made the change. And because we store the state of Active Directory as these changes are occurring, it's really easy for us to go in and be able to execute on this undo operation. Now, we do this for deleted objects just the same as we do it for changed objects. I can restore a deleted object and get all of its attributes back. If I have a deleted object that happens to be a an OU that contains 1,000 user objects underneath it, I can simply restore the OU, restore all child objects, and away I go with my restoral, and it brings back the entire tree. We can see configuration partition changes. So here's my description change on this subnet object, and just the same way I could see those in changed items, I see it in the configuration partition, and I can also undo those changes. We can do it on Active Directory integrated DNS. If there have been Active Directory integrated DNS changes, let me just change my time frame to get a little bit of activity about that. I've got a bunch of A records that have been changed. I can go ahead and right click and undo those just the same way I can any other changes that I'm doing within the system. And again, GPO changes. So I have the ability to see GPO changes that are happening over time. So here I've got a GPO change that occurred to my desktop security policy. And what I can do is I can grab and compare those differences. Let's say I'll do it in a side-by-side view, and I want to compare version 1 versus version 2 of the computer changes that I see here. So I'm going to go ahead and compare those two. And if I look at the GPO on the right that's been changed, you'll see that I've got an annotated GPMC settings report. I'm just going to scroll down and look for the changes that I'm interested in. And there's a change to an audit policy where the failure option was removed from this version of the policy. And then here's another setting that was removed as well. So I've got essentially changes that have happened to this GPO. If I decide that this version, which is the version that I'm working with, is not the version I want, I can click on this version, which is the original baseline version, and click restore, and we have the ability to restore the GPO with or without its links. So flexible, GPO differencing capability within the product to be able to see exactly what's going on. We have a number of in-the-box reports. Stale user accounts shows me users that haven't logged on within 60 days. I have a number of different reports that I can run, including account lockout history, password security policies, unlinked GPOs, sensitive user accounts. You can define which groups are considered sensitive, but by default, they're all the built-in logical ones like domain admins, schema admins, etc. And a role-based access control system that lets you set very granular control over who can do what to what within the product. So if you have a help desk that you want to be able to undo changes on just user objects within the marketing OU, you can run that scenario through our RBAC model and generate just that view for those users. If you have auditors that want to be able to see changes happening to Active Directory in the changed items view, but not be able to right-click and undo those, we can control that ability as well. So you can give read-only access to the data. So really a lot of flexibility, a lot of capability in terms of being able to see changes happening in the directory in real time. We're not taking backups. We're not requiring you to mount backups. The data is as real time as you were seeing it happen in my demo, and giving you the ability to revert those changes as needed. So I think with that, I'm just going to drop back to my slideshow, draw a little conclusion, and then we'll take some questions. So just in conclusion, AD auditing, obviously necessary. We should all be doing it. That there's definitely a lot of value in getting audit data, but it can be overwhelming. So I think it's important to focus and to differentiate within your own organization and categorize what is critical versus operational and what the thresholds are for both of those. I see a lot of shops that turn on AD auditing and just they get flooded by it, and then they just grow to ignore it over time. And I think that's great as a kind of run before you walk sort of approach. But I think we're at a point now where we have to be much more sophisticated about how we and what we pay attention to within auditing. And then just as a summary on our DS Protector product, we have the ability to track changes, to audit who made those changes, and to roll back those changes within a single real-time actionable view. So let's go ahead and bring up the question dialog, and we'll see what kind of questions we have, and then I'll let Ali ask some questions.
Great, thanks, Darren. So our first question for you, Darren, is can you describe again what a Kerberos golden ticket is?
Yeah, sorry, that was a little, there was a little vagueness in that, but a kerberos golden ticket, essentially what happens is if the user or if somebody has, so there's a special account called KRB TGT in every Active Directory domain. And this account is a privileged system level account. It's maintained by Active Directory itself, but it does have a password. And the KRB TGT password is part of what's used to sign ticket granting ticket requests. And so if the TGT password is compromised by someone, by an attacker, then arbitrary folks could be able to sign and create TGT requests for any resource that they want. So that's essentially kind of a high-level description of a golden ticket attack. And there's also something called a silver ticket attack, which is one step below that. But bottom line is, if somebody has compromised your KRB TGT password, then all bets are off in terms of preventing them from getting access to anything. And the solution typically is assuming you get them out of your environment, is to do a forcible reset of that account, password reset of that account. And actually you have to do it twice because the previous password is kept by the account for historical reasons. So you actually have to do it twice to flush out the compromised password.
All right, thank you. Okay, so our second question for you, Darren, is does Semperis DS Protector have the ability to revert changes to any object types, including custom schema objects and attributes that I've added to my own AD?
Yeah, good question. So absolutely, we can handle any objects, including if you've got custom schema changes. So when I talk about custom schema, I'm talking about you've added your own object classes and attributes. We will see those, and if they're populated with data and that data changes, we will undo those. We don't, because you can't undo an actual schema change. So if you've made a change to the schema, we don't have the ability to undo that. It's an important but useful distinction.
Cool, thanks, Darren. All right, so our third question is, could the directory service change auditing become very noisy?
Yeah, so good question. So when we talk about directory services changes auditing, you have to kind of put that in contrast to other types of auditing you may be doing, like log on, log off, service, kerberos logging. If you think about your own Active Directory and how often events are changing in Active Directory, it actually tends to be not very often. So as an example, I think in some customers that we've worked with who are really large customers, maybe we'll see 10 changes a second to Active Directory. So if you think about 10 events in a second, that's really not all that much compared to other types of events. So what my experience is that it's probably like a 10-to-1 ratio between in a typical environment on a typical day between other types of events showing up in the event log versus Active Directory change events. So while it's possible that if you're really just pounding Active Directory day and night with changes that you could get lots of events, but it's not, if I had to pick, it's not the main source of noisiness in the event log.
Okay, great, thank you. So we're going to take one more question. Do you have?
I think we have time for a couple more there.
Great, so we'll take some more questions.
Yeah.
All right, so our next question then is, do you have documentation for setting up, say, some sismon group policy?
Yeah, so the link that I I put a link into the chat window, and it's the just trying to look and see. I think it's the one that says sysinternal sismon suspicious activity guide. It's the first link that I pasted in. That will give you some guidance on how you can use group policy to deploy those configurations.
Great. Next question, is there delegated access of the tool?
Yeah, so I think you're probably referring to DS Protector. So that you might have asked this before I showed the RBAC model, but we do have that really granular delegated access where you can delegate at an OU level, you can delegate at a container level, and you can even delegate at an attribute level. So for example, if you have confidential attributes that you don't want certain users to be able to see, you can exclude those from the view that those users get. So they might see changes to other attributes, but they won't see those confidential attributes.
All right, Darren, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all.
All right. Well, thank you all for spending time with us today. We're going to be sending up a follow-up email with the recording of the webinar. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Darren, myself, or you can send an email over to info@semperis.com, and we will direct you to the right people. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Sorry, I just put my email address up in case anyone needs it.
Thanks, Darren.